check the time here. So this should take about 60 minutes or whatever. I can't see anyone. Normally I would do like a show of hands, how many people are beginners, but okay, maybe show of hands. How many people are beginners here? Oh, great. So at least half the people in the audience. Perfect. You'll like this performance. There's going to be a lot of pretty pictures, a lot of interesting stories and wacky mushrooms and things like that. Some things from right around here and some things from far away, other far-flung parts of the world, etc. So without further ado, we'll take it away. The theme is A Resilient Planet Needs Fungi Now, and you'll see that theme kind of presented throughout the presentations of different fungi that I'll feature, especially right at the beginning. But anyways, also during the presentation, and I guess there's people on Zoom, so hi everyone on Zoom if you're zooming in. Also throughout the presentation, sometimes there will be very obvious, overt, shameless ads for my books and things like that. Sometimes they'll be subliminal. You won't know I'm advertising products and stuff like that. I have books over here that I really need to sell so that I can have room to take Allison to Telluride in my car, because right now there's not enough room. So please help us out and alleviate us of a lot of these books. So a lot of the stories will come from this book here, The Lives of Fungi by Princeton University Press. And this just came out a couple years ago. There's sort of two main themes running through this book. When the publishers contracted me to do the book, they had an idea for different things to be in a mycological book than a lot of other guidebooks or even mycological textbooks for mycology courses, which I've taught a number of times. So they had some things that they wanted to come out that have been in a number of issues of Fungi magazine over the years, a lot of interesting stories. So the sort of the two main themes in the book is that much of what we thought we knew about fungi for a long, long time turns out in recent light of recent research ain't necessarily so. And then the other theme is that a lot of the stuff that goes on in the fifth kingdom, in the kingdom of fungi, is hidden in plain sight all around us. I'll show you some fungi from the other side of the world, and wouldn't it be great to go see these wacky things? But I'll show you equally wacky things that you can find literally right outside the door here that you've never even heard of, and it's every bit as exciting and interesting, and what they're doing in the environment is pretty neat too. So this will be sort of the two main themes of a lot of the tales. So in fact, we'll start here. We'll just start literally right outside the door. Yesterday, Greg Sanchez, who opened the show, showed me a couple mushrooms. He'd just been dropping off his daughter, so he was excited to bring mushrooms from the Midwest, from Illinois, from Chicago, where I came from as well, just a couple days ago. And he showed this one. Has anyone ever seen this mushroom before, the ash bolete? So not very many hands. So this is, I mean, you can see this mushroom here. It looks like a bolete. It's got pores underneath. They're not super small round pores or super small angular pores. They're marulioid sort of pores. They're like this kind of veiny pore surface that's under the underside of Marulius fungi. So that's how it gets the name Marulioides. In fact, ash bolete's gone by a bunch of names because it's clearly a bolete. It's kind of big and puffy on top and round and has a stem and these pores underneath. So of course it's always been a bolete. It was originally called Boletus Marulioides, because again, it's like Marulioides. Then with more recent research, like a century ago, people started using a new name for it. They placed it in the genus Gyrodon because it wasn't exactly like things that were true Boletus. And then more recently, we now call it Boletinellus Marulioides, but you can still call it the ash bolete. Where and why and when would you see this thing? So this thing occurs assuredly with white ash trees, some other species too, I've heard. I've only seen it with white ash, but if you live in a part of the world where eastern white ash, Fraxinus americana, is, for sure, now through the fall, you will see this. It's super common everywhere. Lawns, parks, along the streets. You don't have to go in the forest to see it. In fact, you're much more likely to see it on grassy areas and lawns and where soil's compacted and things. If it fruits at all, there'll be lots and lots of them, and they're great big. They can be platter sized. Everyone, of course, is always enticed to eat it because it is a bolete, and then they're usually not so impressed because it tastes kind of like mud, and not the good kind. And even with like a little metallic tang to it as well. So it's really awful mushroom, and it's as far as edibility goes, and it's soft and gushy. It really has no value. You'll see people claiming to eat it online. They're completely lying. It's absolutely horrible. Anyways, Anyways, so Greg had this, and several people were asking about this. They're like, "Oh, have you seen it before?" No, I've absolutely never seen it. I'm belaboring this whole point because this photo was taken about 1 block from the entrance here several years ago, believe it or not. So there was planting along the street. The street trees were Eastern white ash that they were planted as a pretty street tree. And of course, out here, they're tolerant to the diseases you have out here. And it does nicely. So I pulled up, I forget who was in my car. We were coming to the fair 10 or 15 years ago. And we hopped out of the car and started walking. And sure enough, there's a big cluster of these. I'm like, oh, this is a cool mushroom. And so everyone's like, well, of course it's a bolete and it's occurring with the ash tree. As you know, all boletes are mycorrhizal with trees. That's in all guidebooks. Of course, we now know it's not actually true. Some boletes absolutely are not mycorrhizal, or they don't have to be anyway. And this is one. This has always occurred with white ash, of course, known to be mycorrhizal with ash, except that it's not. So actually, it's not even attached to the roots of the ash tree, but it's always with the ash tree. So what the hell's going on? Here's what's going on. It's actually attached. If you were digging around, so I dug these up from someone's lawn. This photo was taken, like 90 seconds before the lady came out of the house and ran us off her lawn for digging up these things. But anyways, if you dig them up and get the dirt and stuff around the bottom of the stem and look really closely, you'll see these little black pea-like things up there at the aerial. What are those? So this thing is not attached to the ash tree. There's an aphid that feeds exclusively on the roots of white ash trees. It flies around when it's in the adult stage and then crawls down the trunk of the tree and then either lays eggs of larvae that start growing or it itself latches onto the roots of the tree and then feeds the rest of its life. But it doesn't get away with feeding on the tree exactly because, of course, the tree knows about this thing. They've co-evolved for millions of years. The tree's going to try to kick this thing out. And so only because this fungus is in the soil and forms this gall, this covering around the bugs that are inside there, that's the only way the bug gets to pull this off. So believe it or not, these great big mushrooms that are like platter-sized, each one of them is attached by a very thin hypha of the fungus that's attached to this gall, that's attached to the bug, that's attached to the tree. All that nutrition that makes this big mushroom, it seems, passes from the gall to the mushroom. And in fact, here's the bugs. If you cut one of these galls open, you'll see inside one to several of the little aphids, juveniles, and that's where they live. I'm not sure how long, at least the whole season. And then they, make their way to the surface of the soil and fly away and keep the whole thing going. Isn't that amazing? This mushroom has long been one of the most common mushrooms in Eastern North America. Everyone knows about it. It's in all books, except it's not mycorrhizal. This was only discovered fairly recently, hidden in plain sight. The other ironic thing about this is it's not native to here because it has to occur with white ash, which is not native to here. So it turns out right about now and going forward, here is about the only place you'll be able to see this because the white ash trees, of course, are getting extirpated in the Midwest by a beetle, the emerald bark beetle that has come in and kills them. So where Greg found them was downtown Chicago. The beetles are not, like all beetles, they're not very good flyers. So they haven't been able to fly over the city of Chicago, which is enormous. There's a lot of concrete there. They'll get there eventually and kill those trees as well. But out where I live and all the way to the Iowa border, and maybe even now into eastern Nebraska, you'll see dead ash trees everywhere because they're super common all along the fences and things. And, they're done for. There's probably going to be some that are resistant to this beetle, and then maybe they'll come back, or maybe they'll just go extinct. Really knows, but it's an interesting story of, a symbiosis between a whole bunch of organisms, parasites and mutualists, etc. So again, just to emphasize the point, much of what we thought we knew about fungi ain't necessarily so, and a lot of the really cool things hidden in plain sight. This is one of the coolest stories of nature, and it would be right on my lawn in the Midwest where I live. You don't have to travel around the world to see stuff like this necessarily. Okay, so if you've not been under a rock for the last couple of years, you've probably seen in pretty much all types of publications, certainly all nature and science publications, about stuff going on in the environment that's not so good. The climate heating up and habitat loss and biodiversity loss and invasive species, etc. And this has become a big problem. Here in Colorado, especially with climate change, of course, there's been some massive wildfires just recently. my family was camping in Rocky Mountain National Park. It was just a couple years ago when that big fire came through, burned up half the park. This is one of the biggest national parks we have in North America. And we actually had to get evacuated, along with all of Estes Park got evacuated. It was awful. And of course, it's undoubtedly because of the planet warming up. So like pretty much all other publications, the journal that I published, Fungi Magazine, we had a couple years ago an issue devoted. We do 4 issues a year that are seasonal, and then we do one that's on a special topic. So a couple years ago, you can't see the writing on here probably because you're too far away. That doesn't really matter. You can kind of get the gist of this horrific picture in the center. That was the centerfold. We had an entire edition devoted to all of these sorts of calamities happening to the planet that are impacting us as well as fungi, which is, of course, awful. But throughout the issue, we had a whole bunch of stories of scientists doing work with fungi to solve a lot of these problems, to solve problems of invasive species, not necessarily controlling fire in the forest, but working on post-fire restoration of the forest, because it turns out the fire isn't necessarily the biggest problem in a lot of cases, and habitat loss and loss of diversity and overuse of insecticides. We had a whole bunch of articles on how people are using fungi to sort of alleviate some of these problems with the environment. So, this is how fungi are being used to produce a more resilient planet, and how they make better soils and how they fight pests and things. That's sort of the subject of the research. We know that they do this, but how they do this is what people are trying to find out. Okay, so sorry to bum you out with that slide there. Everyone's now quiet. It's like, Christ, is this what it's going to be like the rest of the show? It's not. It's going to be great the rest of the way. Nothing but mushrooms. So in addition to being North American Mycological Association, which is sort of the umbrella national, and I include Canada and Mexico in there, the national umbrella for a whole bunch of mycological societies like this one. There's at least 90 to 100 NAMA clubs, this umbrella group. They put out publications that everyone can enjoy and learn from. They also have an annual foray somewhere around North America every year. It moves around. This year it's going to be in Washington. Last year it was North Carolina. Last year was North Carolina. It kind of moves around coast and central, etc. But also I'm in MSA, the Mycological Society of America, which is the academic society. They put out an academic journal, Mycologia, etc. And this is what more of the academics belong to. But both groups obviously have a really important role in educating people. And I'm the liaison officer of MSA to NAMA. And I think I'm maybe the best person to do that because I'm in front of NAMA clubs every single month and mostly hang out with NAMA-ites, much more so than MSA-ites, if that's a word. So it's a really exciting time to become a mycologist and get involved. Besides these 2 agencies, you've probably heard of iNaturalist and Mushroom Observer. These are places where you can post photos of things you've collected and have people help you to identify them. But also these data that are posted there are used by actual scientists to document what's in the environment and where, and get sort of a baseline of what's in the habitat before we have any further climate change or habitat loss, etc. There's other things you can do as well to get excited and learn about things and take part. There's this fundus group which funds projects to go out and collect mushrooms and analyze and do DNA sequence analysis, etc. There's bio-blitzes and even specific myco-blitzes that take place all around that you can take part in. And one of these blitzes is a type of event where in 24 hours, they try to document all the species that are in a given forest or area in a single 24-hour period. If it's a bio-blitz, they look at amphibians and birds and everything. If it's a myco-blitz, obviously it's just mushrooms. Plus, it's a lot of fun. Look at this. Look at this mycologist here. She was miserable 2 minutes before this photo was taken, but she sees mushrooms, and now all of a sudden, this is great. And this, of course, is Alison Pouliot, who's actually in the audience. She just got off a plane from Switzerland like an hour and a half ago, and she's here to go give some lectures at Telluride. She's quite a famous Australian writer, and probably a lot of you have books of hers. But this is what happens when you see mushrooms. People get excited. If you're already in a club, how about teach people in your environment the importance of habitat and what fungi do in the environment. They don't just rot stuff; they do a lot of other things. And then as I mentioned, a lot of these happenings, iNaturalist and clubs mostly are interested right now in documenting what we have. And it's pretty neat because there's new techniques people are using, a lot of DNA sequence analysis that's quick and helps people to figure out one species from another, which is tough to do sometimes because things look really similar. And this is really important work, of course. I've throughout my entire career, I've been more of like an evolutionary biologist or an ecologist. So I've always been much more interested in in what the organism is doing in the environment, and less so its name. And in fact, names change, but what the ecology of the organism is, that doesn't change. And in a lot of cases, they really are the puppet masters of the whole environment. Plants, for the most part, bring in energy into the environment as the primary producer, but fungi are basically responsible for farming those plants through their associations, and many ways are even more important than plants are to really the lives of everything on the planet. So I've always been much more interested in what they're doing in the environment. And so this is a good place to start, because a lot of times we don't know what stuff's doing in the environment. We think we know, but again, sometimes what we've read or been taught turns out ain't necessarily so. A lot of the fungi that I learned as a student, decades ago, we now know there's a lot of other things about them that we didn't know at that time. I just showed you a whole bunch of pictures of morels. Usually that gets people's attention because everyone loves morels. As I was listening to that music that Greg was playing, that was great music. And I guess they were singing, they were happy that they were finding mushrooms and stuff like that. I can tell you, in the Midwest, when it's morel season, you will not hear singing from the forest. People are quiet. They do not want to give away their spot. So I like that music. That was nice, but that's not going to happen when I'm mushrooming, by the way. So I showed you a bunch of pictures of morels because in the Midwest where I live, we have those mostly were pictures from the Midwest. Those are big blonde morels that are naturals. They have an association with stuff in the forest. Some seem to be maybe mycorrhizal with some trees. Some are saprobes and rot things. And out here in Colorado, you have some other types too. You have things like burn morels after burn. And everyone in the East is that knows about this phenomenon out here in the Rocky Mountains or the West, where there's burns and then these tremendous fruitings of burn morels, wish we had something like that in the East. But of course, they've never been seen. Turns out we do have them in the East. They've never been seen because we suppress fires. There's been a couple occasions when they have been seen, when there were weird situations of fires, which of course has always puzzled people because in a century or 150 years, we've never seen burn morels. And all of a sudden they happen this year. How did that fire, entice this type of a mushroom to come here? Was it the smoke that somehow, like a siren song, drew in the spores from this fungus that's floating around in the environment? Or was there like some sort of chemical release that was a trigger, or what? We didn't know when I was a student. It was mystifying about stuff like this. People have known about burn morels for centuries. In Europe, people knew about it hundreds of years ago. There's laws on the books in many places in Europe that specifically says you can't burn down the forest to have this happen, and these laws are centuries old. So we've known about what caused it. We never really knew until fairly recently. And it's not just burn morels that have this phenomenon of appearing in massive amounts after fire. There's other fungi too. Show of hands, who's ever picked burn morels before? Did you see some other fungi too? Did you see these? Zillions. Yeah, the ground will be covered. They're pretty small. It's another ascomycete. It's a cup, as you can see here, and the ground will be covered with them. It's called Geopixus carbonaria. This photo is by Kathy Cripps, one of the world authorities on mushrooms. She's up in Montana. And she works with alpine fungi and things like that. So yeah, I mean, everyone's running around filling their buckets with morels, but if you look, there's some other things too that are fire fungi. They're pyrophilous. They're fire loving. Turns out they're in the environment at all times. They don't fruit until something specific happens, a fire, which they've evolved with. This seems kind of weird to think that stuff needs a fire to complete its life cycle. But I mean, we for sure know about trees that are pyrophilous or fire loving. There's a number of different types of conifers that are only too happy for fires to come through. They maybe have protective bark or something, and they have cones called serotinous cones that sit on the tree forever, and they don't open. not until there's a fire hot enough to melt the wax that covers the cone. And then shortly after the fire goes away and things cool down, now these scales open up and all the seeds drop into this, perfect seed bed that's nutrient rich. All the underbrush is burned up, and then that's how that tree completes this life cycle. Wherever there's fire prone areas, including Colorado, there's trees that have serotinous cones. Florida, where there's Florida slash pine, etc. These trees have evolved this over and over, just like these fungi. They've evolved the ability to somehow not only withstand the fire that comes through, but they also, it turns out, are partners with the tree and live inside the tree roots, and probably are responsible for protecting the tree's roots in some ways. That's not really totally certain, but what is certain is then after the fire, the fungus gets going to sort of jumpstart what's left of this tree to get it sprouting back and coming back alive after the fire. And it's not just in North America. These fungi live in Australia. So this is a fungus that probably one person other than me has ever heard of before, because this Australian fungus is normally extremely rare. It's called Lacocephalum mylidae, the stonemaker mushroom. It's a rather large mushroom. They can be platter sized, and they fruit from these big, massive underground, sort of like a sclerotia, like it's like a big tuber underground. And if you were to have gone on iNaturalist or Mushroom Observer, oh, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, you would probably have seen like one observation. So it's very rare, or at least it was a very rare fungus, but people knew about it. In fact, these big tubers here at the bottom, it's a big starchy thing that actually people used to dig up. They would purposely go out looking for these things and dig them up. The indigenous Aboriginal people would purposely go out and find, they would find them in such quantity, they would go looking for them, and these things are known as Aboriginal bread. At least that's what I've read. I've not actually seen it in person. But this thing became really, really rare. Why? Because once Europeans arrived in Australia, just like in the New World, they suppressed fire because, it burns up the forests and people's homes. And now this thing was almost never, ever seen because there weren't any fires that happened. But just a few years ago, there were massive fires all the way around Australia that were burning up everything. And I know this because I was planning a myco tour with my colleague, Pitt, and some of the places we were going to go, the lodges and things totally burned up. So our trip is still on hold to this day. After the fire, though, died down and cooled off, people were reporting these things everywhere. I don't know where you are, Allison, but what do you think? Is this true? Do you remember hearing about this? Yeah. And they're massive, and it's a really cool fungus. What the heck's going on? People knew about it, then it became rare, because it has to have fire to complete its life cycle. The fungus is still in the soil. Maybe it reproduces asexually, and it doesn't even need to make mushrooms and go through sexual reproduction. So it's in the soil, in the plants. It's a partner. It's doing its thing. Only after fire can it complete its life cycle. Pretty cool. And so as you can see, after the fire, now this thing's common. It was everywhere. People couldn't believe it. I saw reports on Facebook and other places. People were like, they'd never heard of this. They'd never seen it. It's everywhere. Pretty neat. So these pyrophilous fungi, they're really super important to the environment, as I alluded to. So after the fire, seeds dropping start sprouting. These are mycorrhizal trees. The fungus in the soil gloms onto the root of this guy to get it a jump start. The fungus brings in moisture to the plant, nutrients, etc. And then also some of the fungi that are in the roots get those trees jump started and going again. That's not going to happen in this patch of forest here. You can see all these trees are dead, which is pretty sad. But you can see the trees that are regrowing, they're growing at a tremendous rate, like 2 or 3 feet per year. So they're getting established really quickly. And so people that work on post-fire restoration, like this lady here, this is Camille Stevens-Ruman. She's a post-fire world authority at Colorado State University, which is kind of neat because that she studies post-fire regeneration of forests in the Rocky Mountains, where they have this phenomenon a lot. And the phenomenon is mostly caused by the pine bark beetle that kills the trees, which then burn up. Her husband, world authority on the pine bark beetle. So I'm sure at their house at the dinner table, they have interesting things to talk about. Both have come to Telluride and given presentations in the past. So as sad as this looks, this bare like lunar landscape, and as sad as this looks, this isn't the really sad part. The sad part is if people like this don't get the forest reestablished right away, the fire is a problem. The bigger problem comes later in the year when it's rainy season. The rains start falling and then washes away what's left of the topsoil. There's no plants to hold on to the soil if they're all gone and burned up. And then when the topsoil will have a real problem, because then nothing will grow there for a really long period of time. If you don't believe me, you can see photos and satellite images of places in the world where this sort of thing has happened. You can go online and see a satellite image of the island of Hispaniola right now. In Hispaniola, if you're not familiar, one half of the island is Dominican Republic, lush, tropical rainforest, tropical paradise, very popular with tourists. The other half of Hispaniola is Haiti, which of course has all sorts of political problems. But in addition, they have a massive problem that's happening right now. The entire country has been turned into a desert. They use a lot of wood to make real charcoal, and they cook with that, and not being good stewards of the land, they haven't put the trees back on the land. So year after year of rainfall with very little forest cover has now washed away all the soil. If you see a satellite image of Hispaniola, it's sort of like a diamond-shaped, almost large island in the Caribbean. There's a perfectly straight line down the middle. That's the border. On one side, it's very lush and green, and that's the Dominican Republic, and they're much more they burn charcoal as well, but they're much better stewards with the forest and then replanting stuff and keeping the trees on the land. And sadly, as bad as things are in Haiti, 50, 100 years from now, things are going to be much worse than now. A lot of famine and things like that, as it just gets harder and harder to grow stuff on the soil. So this sort of work is really super important. Okay, so in addition to interesting stories like this in this book, it's also sort of like a text for general audiences. There's a lot of basic information. Each chapter has basics on fungi, chapter on reproduction, chapter on parasitism, etc. So I threw a couple slides in here because yesterday I was talking to several people that basically admitted that they knew next to nothing whatsoever about fungi. So I thought, well, how about just like a little quickie refresher course? If you remember back in the days when you were in school, taught in maybe a biology class or an ecology class, you probably learned about plants and animals for much of the time. If you covered fungi at all, maybe it was for like one class or part of a class. And unfortunately, that day you probably weren't even paying attention. So you probably learned, next to no fungal basics. So here's some fungal basics in a nutshell. And if you already know all of this stuff, just finish eating your cheese sandwich or something like that, and we'll get to some more complicated things. But so fungi are eukaryotes. I point this out because yesterday that seemed to befuddle some people I was talking to. So life on the planet is either prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Prokaryotes are bacteria. They're, of course, the first life on the planet. There's much more bacteria than anything else by far because they've been on the planet for way, way longer. Prokaryotes are very simple single-celled organisms. They are so simple, in fact, and so small, the bacteria, that they don't have any organelles within their cells. They don't have a membrane-bound nucleus, ribosomes. They don't have anything like that. So they're very, very simple. That's what denotes prokaryotes from eukaryotes. All other life is a eukaryote. So the simplest eukaryotes are single-celled protozoans, and then there's, of course, plants, animals, and fungi. Eukaryotes have much more complex cells. They have a cell that inside of it has membrane-bound organelles, like a nucleus or chloroplasts in the case of plants, et cetera, et cetera. So of course we are eukaryotes. How you would know, if you encountered like a puddle of cells out in the forest, and you're like, wow, I wonder if that's a plant or an animal or a fungus. I don't see a mushroom, so this is going to be kind of tricky. Well, if you also had a microscope right next to that pile of cells, you could figure out possibly what you had. And so here's what separates plants and animals and fungi. So plants have, of course, a cell membrane, and they also have a cell wall made of chitin, and fungi have a cell membrane and also a cell wall, but wait, I said chitin. Cellulose. Yeah, plants have cellulose. Yeah, sorry about that. Rewind the tape. So yeah, plants have a cell wall of cellulose, fungi have a cell wall of chitin, and the cell wall of animals is made of trick question. John's on the spot. Yeah, no cell wall. We don't have cell wall. So that's how you would separate these different kingdoms of life. Other things about fungi, besides being a eukaryote and having a cell wall of chitin, is they're still poorly unknown. We find lots of new species every year. And still a lot of things about their life cycle is not very well known. So as far as like their life cycle and habitat, we're still learning a lot about them. If you knew one thing about fungi, it's that they live in moist areas, right? I mean, that's maybe the only thing anyone really knows about fungi is they have to have moist areas. And if that's what you basically got out of that one day of science class back when you were in school, unfortunately, even that was completely wrong. It turns out fungi are dominant all over the planet. And some of the driest areas, believe it or not, are where fungi are the dominant organisms. Isn't it hard to believe? And everyone here's familiar with going into the forest. This is Colorado. There's dry environments. And where are the fungi? Well, they're there. They're not visible. They're not doing their sexual reproductive things. So you're not seeing the telltale signs of them, these mushrooms, but they're there. And in fact, they're arguably more important in dry areas like Colorado than in the Midwest where I live. So this scene here looks a lot like Colorado. It's not. This is actually Antarctica. So Antarctica is a huge continent, mostly covered by very thick ice, but not all of it. Around the perimeter, there are areas where there is ice, it's ice-free year-round, and there's life. Not a lot of life. In this view here, I mean, you could see an entire valley. And here's what you see. If you're tuning in at home and you can't tell, I'll tell you what you see. This valley is, who knows, like, I don't know, 100 miles across. A lot of big rocky boulders. There's tufts of some sort of a plant or two growing here. Doesn't look like very many kinds of plants. There's quite a few of them, but not many kinds. You won't see in this entire biome here, you won't see fish or amphibians or probably no birds. It's unlikely any mammals. There's probably some types of insects. Believe it or not, in this extremely arid environment that's very windy, very dry, much of the time extremely cold, also has extremely high amounts of ultraviolet radiation coming through because the poles of the planet have historically had tremendous amounts of UV that will fry almost anything. Obviously, these plants have figured out. But would you believe in a hellscape like this, the dominant organisms are fungi? That's hard to believe. And some people actually are leaving right now, just like, no, that's enough. I'm not buying this. This guy is clearly, he's already started in on his magic mushrooms that he's taking to tell you right now. No, it's totally true. The thing is, this wasn't known until just a few years ago. So where are the fungi? All those rocks you see there, that's where the fungi are. Someone had the bright idea to start smashing rocks in Antarctica and found something called endolithic inside rocks, endolithic lichens. You're probably familiar with lichens because Colorado has lots of lichens. Dry areas like Colorado, up in the mountains, even around town, on park benches, sides of buildings, tombstones, there's a lot of lichens. And a lichen is sort of like a community that gets together to form sort of a superorganism. What you see on the outside part is the fungal part. The reason for its color, like if it's a green lichen or something like that, or an orange lichen, much of that color is from its photosynthetic partner. So it's a fungus and an algae or a cyanobacterium, or sometimes all three. And in fact, we just learned as of a couple of years ago, there's actually a fourth. The true puppet master of the lichen in a lot of cases is yet another fungus that's in such small amounts, no one actually even ever saw it. You can only see its DNA in there. That's a type of a yeast. In any case, so what's going on here? So the UV is far too intense for a lot of things to grow out in the open. And also it's very cold and very windy and very drying. So these guys have figured out if they grow just under the surface of these porous rocks, there's still enough sunlight coming through that its photosynthetic partner, its algae, can still do its thing and photosynthesize. And the fungal part is the part that sort of houses the whole thing. The fungus has a lot of complex enzymes that can slowly kind of break down the rock and leach nutrients out. So whenever this gets wet and it's enough, warm enough, it starts photosynthesizing and growing. I mean, this thing isn't going to grow turn into a redwood someday, obviously, because it's just too cold and dry there, but it can eke out a living and it's the dominating organism. So these black bands, oftentimes with green or other colors, this is the endolithic lichens. Has anyone ever even heard of this before? The most common thing on maybe the largest continent, nobody knew about until just recently. So this is what's pretty cool about fungi. It seems like some of these hostile environments is too tough for them. And for sure it is too tough for some of them, but some of the fungi have figured out ways to occur in some of these out of the way places. Okay, so if you're pretty good with those fungal basics, here's some more fungal basics. If you, on that one day in school when you were learning about fungi and probably not paying attention and passing notes, the one thing that the teacher probably told you is that, besides being kind of gross and moldy or whatever, the one thing that's good about fungi is they are saprobic or saprotrophic. They rot stuff. This is what fungi do. Everyone did learn that, right? Show of hands, you learned that. Yeah. Turns out that is true, but only partially true. It turns out most fungi, probably the majority, maybe the vast majority, actually do not rot stuff. They do something else, which I'll show you, because that's actually, in my opinion, the more exciting, interesting ones. But just to satisfy your curiosity, so what is going on with fungi rotting things? And, our teacher said, it's pretty lucky that we have these fungi. I know you're turning up your noses to molds, class. Greg, is this what happens when you were teaching? So I know you're turning up your nose to molds and things, but bear with me, class. They perform a really great service, because were it not for fungi, all the plants and things that have died, they'd be piling up on the planet. We'd get buried beneath them. And of course, as preposterous as that sounds, it actually is true. All this woody debris that piles up from plants when they die and fall down in the forest, there's not very many things that can break down the cellulose of plant cell walls. You've seen animals eating plants. There's wood-boring beetles, wood-boring wasps, cattle, gray. Seems like they're gobbling up and eating and digesting all of this plant material. They're really not. The cellulose of the plants is broken down inside their gut, or some of these things like the bark beetles or the wood-boring beetles or the wood wasps. A lot of times they carry a fungus with them, inoculate the wood, and then wait a long period of time, like maybe a year, while the fungus kind of partially degrades the wood, and then they start feeding on it, believe it or not. So things like cattle and animals that eat this very nutrient poor, high cellulose material like grass, they're big, and not because they can be big. They're big because they have to be big. They have to have great big giant stomachs that are fermentation vats that has microbes and fungi in there to break down this very nutrient poor cellulosic material. And it takes a long time, so that's why they have to be eating a lot and have these great big giant stomachs. So yeah, there's not very many fungi that can break down wood. And in fact, it took a long time before these fungi actually even arose on the planet. There's bacteria, some of them can break down wood a little bit, but for sure wood rot fungi are the champs. So wood really did pile up on the planet for long, long periods of time. We know this because as it got buried and it became anaerobic, it turned into fossil fuels. So if you dig down through layers of soil, and you've seen pictures of stuff like this, you can go down really deep. You're going back in time. You're going back further back in time, the further down you go. Eventually, you'll get to a place where there's fossil fuels. And I mean, this state, you can drive across I-70. You'll see lots of fracking stations and tanks and things like that, where they're pumping out fossil fuels, because this stuff, it didn't oxidize, it didn't rot. It did the opposite. It reduced, like when you make charcoal, and made petroleum and natural gas. And that's really deep down into the soil. So if you then reverse directions, now start coming back up through the layers, you'll go to a place where there's a layer, and above that, there will be no more fossil fuels found. If you were to dig inside that layer right there, you would find something new in that layer of soil that wasn't in any of the other layers of soil. You would find spores of wood rot fungi. In all the layers above that, you'll find spores of wood rot fungi. They don't really break down, they fossilize. There's spores of a lot of other fungi too, but different wood rot fungi spores now are seen above this layer, and no more fossil fuels. So no more fossil fuels are being made. And you know this because when you go in the forest, all of the wood that falls down, it's being rotted by stuff. It's not going to fossilize. It's not going to turn into petroleum or natural gas or coal or anything. And so the groups of fungi that have come onto the planet that can rot wood are obviously very beneficial to the planet, but there's not very many of them. And they're pretty well understood how they do their business. So the thing with wood is, the cellulose that makes up the cell walls, and the lignin that sort of is the concrete to hold the cells together. Both of these are big moieties of molecules. It's very, and even the wood rot fungi are not that good at breaking all of them down. So typically wood rot fungi specialize in either breaking down the cellulose or the lignin, and not really so much of both. And so that's why when you look at a log in the forest, you can actually tell what's going on by what's left behind after the fungus broke it down. Have you walked through the forest before and seen like well-rotted logs that look like this up here? Kind of red, brown, and kind of blocky and cuboidal. You probably thought, wow, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what kind of tree that was. Whatever it was, when it dies and falls down and rots and falls apart, that's how that tree seems to fall apart. And you've probably also seen, maybe not quite as common in Colorado, but you've seen this other type of phenomenon where the tree doesn't look at all like that. It looks more like white and stringy as it falls apart. And isn't that interesting that whatever this kind of tree is, when it dies and rots, it falls apart in this manner. If you thought that's what was going on, you were wrong. What's going on and causes this to result this way or that is actually pretty much entirely because of what fungus got to the wood first. If you see a tree that's rotted, and this is what's left behind, this brown rot, this is from brown rot fungi. So these fungi break down the cellulose and remove it, and they're feeding on it. Much of the time they feed on conifers. So a lot of conifer wood breaks down this way, but doesn't have to. And a lot of times hardwoods break down this way, but absolutely doesn't have to. But anyways, some of the Basidium mycete fungi that we're really familiar with do this sort of phenomenon. So it's likely that you saw the mushrooms attached to the tree. Things like Fomitopsis pinicola, the red-belted polypore, Pholinus species. I'll show you a picture of this in a second. Ledoporus, which is the sulfur shell for chicken of the woods, and then also the Dyer's polypore, Phalus schweinitzii. These are all brown rot fungi. The white rot fungi that break down the lignin and also the cellulose to some extent, but leave a lot of cellulose behind. These guys are often hit hardwoods, but not always. And some of them are basidiomycetes, and also some of them can be ascomycetes too. So things like the honey mushroom are malarias. These are white rotters. Oyster mushrooms, Pleurotus species, are white rot fungi. Ganodermas like the artist conch or reishi and these sorts of mushrooms, these are white rot fungi. Turkey tail fungus, which is Termites, it's a white rot fungus. And then also some ascomycetes, so things like Xylaria, the dead man's fingers that seem to appear on the sides of logs and look kind of mysterious like blackened fingers. Those are white rotters, as are Pizizas. Those are sort of brown cups that you'll see in the forest, and also Chlorosiboria. And I'll show a picture of that as well. The reason for the two color fonts here is I'm going to show you some more exciting photos of these rot fungi. So here's Pholinus tremuli. You've probably seen this before. This photo was taken in Colorado on aspen of Pholinus tremuli, very common on quaking aspen, trembling aspen, etc. So if you think about what aspen trees look like, wherever there were branches on the tree, there's sort of a scar on the tree. These polypores are somewhat hard to notice because they kind of look like the scars. They get very cracked on the top. I've purposely taken this photo from the underside so you can see it's for sure a polypore, not maybe just one of these scars from where the branch came off. Here's this. So this is like part of the scar around here, but this is the fungus. There's the branch there. And so these are polypores. It's a fungus that's inside rotting the dead part of the tree. And then this eruption out the side is the fruit body of the fungus. On the underside here, which looks brown, has very small brown pores, and that's where the spores come out. The basidia, they're not on gills like agaricus. They're on the walls of these tubes, and the spores come flying out and disperse this way. And this is, for the most part, the only part of the fungus you ever see. It'd be kind of cool to go on the inside side of the tree and see what's going on. And through the miracles of science, I can show you what's going on were you to look inside the tree. You can see where this fungus has entered a wound or where a branch scar was or something like that. It started to rot this dead heartwood of the tree. And you can see it's a brown rotter. It's brown and kind of blocky and cuboidal. But you can see something else inside the intact wood as well. It's kind of two different shades of wood. And what else do you see at those red arrows? Kind of like black lines, right? So that's spalting. If you're familiar with woodworking, or you're a wood turner, or maybe you just have wooden objects in your house like a bowl or a guitar or cabinets, you might have spalted wood that has these like interesting black lines running through it. Woodworkers look for this kind of wood. Oftentimes the wood's called bird's eye maple or curly maple or something like that. Does that ring a bell with some people? Yeah, there's no such thing as bird's eye maple or curly maple. It's maple, or maybe it's not even maple, but it has a fungus that's gotten into the wood and caused these black lines. So what's going on here? So the fungus was rotting away the heartwood part of the tree. When you look at a tree, by the way, in case you don't know, when you look at a tree growing in the forest, they can be massive organism. Most of what you see, of course, is the bark, but underneath the bark, that's the living part of the tree where the vascular tissue is. Pretty thin section of the tree. Everything on the inside of there is previous year's growth, and that's the heartwood, and it's dead, you know? So a lot of these fungi rot the heartwood. There's a lot of material there, and as long as they stay put, the tree usually doesn't matter. It doesn't matter so much to the tree as long as they don't bother the living part of the tree. So what's going on here is this fungus is not necessarily satisfied rotting this dead old part. It's moving into the living part of the tree and attempting to kill and digest the tissues there. Of course, the tree senses this is going on, so the tree starts blasting this invader with a sort of an immune response with chemicals that can kill the fungus. The fungus then does what a lot of organisms do when their cells are being blasted by radiation, energy, disease, other things. Our cells do it when you go out in the sunlight. Melanin starts to be produced, and melanin protects the cells from the energy of the sun and also chemicals and things like that. So the fungus is producing melanin in its hyphae at the outermost front of where it's moved into the wood and sort of walled off this area inside here. So if you could imagine this in 3 dimensions and rotate around, now there's a column of wood here on the inside side of the spalted area. That's controlled by the fungus, and it's going to rot it. On the outside part is still where the tree is intact and the fungus hasn't moved yet. So melanin, our cells make it, bugs make it, fish make it, fungi make it, a lot of organisms make it, bacteria make it, and it's used for the same purposes. It's to protect cells. A lot of different things are interestingly made from spalted wood. You can see this is made from sugar maple, this pipe here. This intact wood here is clearly sugar maple, looks nice and healthy. The wood on the inside here has been bleached by the fungus as it's starting to break it down. And sure enough, here's these spalted lines. If you're from England, you might know about the famous Tunbridge ware antiques, which were made in the 1800s near Tunbridge Wells in England for a few decades. And people would buy these little wooden boxes with this wood inlay with various interesting patterns, geometrical shapes, but also woodland scenes. And these craftsmen had special people that contributed to their art, basically mycologists, basically foragers, because they would get their hands on special kind of wood that was very prized. There's religious icons in churches too that have these special woods that are dyed green and pink and yellow. Here's, you can see the green here. This is from a special type of wood that was very rare called green oak. It wasn't actually green oak. It was wood that had been attacked by this fungus. Oh, where's Chlorosiboria? I thought I had a slide of it. If you've seen Chlorosiboria in the forest, it turns the wood kind of that verdigris color, like it's a very unnatural blue-green color, like aquamarine. Well, it's that color. So these woodworkers would have people go out and forage for these special types of wood that they could produce these boxes for, and they could make elaborate woodland scenes, etc., with these different colored pieces of wood. I have one of these boxes. This isn't mine, but I have one very similar to it that was made in 1890 that I got from an antique shop in London. Allison, you know about Tunbridge ware? Yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of a popular thing still to this day in a lot of homes as an antique heirloom. In the New World, we don't necessarily know about it, but it's really cool because it's the result of fungi that can do this wood rot and this spalting phenomenon. You can see this right around your house because lots of different fungi that rot woody materials do the spalting phenomenon to sort of wall off their place and keep others out. If you dig around in pine needles around your house, you'll see needle cast fungi that do the same thing. Wherever these little red X's are, or little red arrows are, you can see a perfectly straight black line across these little needles. And so these are colonies of this fungus. Have you ever heard of this before? Lophodermium pinastri. This is one of the most common fungi of the entire northern hemisphere of the world, and almost no one's ever even heard of it. Super common. It causes a needle cast. And presumably what's going on is, I mean, we don't even really know about the life cycle. Some think it's a disease. Some people think maybe it's a beneficial endophyte. We don't really know. What is known as it lives inside the needle for its whole life. When the needle dies and falls off the tree, then the fungus goes into sort of saprobic mode and starts rotting the needle, does this spalting thing. So presumably this is one guy in here, and then maybe this is a different colony in here between these spalted lines. And as it decays this little patch of needle, then it produces their fruit bodies. They're not so big, they're tiny little specks, and makes the spores. They blast up in the air and then somehow get back into the tree. If you're going to ask if this fungus is edible, culinary notes, I don't have any because it's a little too small. But what it lacks in size, though, it makes up in numbers, and it's super common, and obviously has an important role in the environment. Has anyone ever seen this before on needles? Yeah, it's actually super common, and most people don't even know about it. So kind of a cool little fungus. Okay, so showed the rotters. So now let's get showed the saprotrophs. So now we'll get to the biotrophs. These are fungi that live with a living partner. And so I purposely use the word here, symbionts, and have quotes around it because a lot of times in popular literature or on the news, you'll hear this term symbiont used to mean, like mutually beneficial. The two organisms worked symbiotically to the benefit of both or whatever. That's not really what symbiont means. Symbiont just means organisms, both of which their lives are obligately intertwined. So mutualistic organisms can be symbionts, but also pathogens and their host can be symbionts. So COVID virus and humans are symbionts of one another. Obviously, one is not benefiting us in any possible way. So anyway, so that's the term there. So most fungi probably are not just biotrophic, but probably actually parasites. In fact, most life on the planet assuredly is a parasite. You can just sort of do a simple mathematics exercise in your head. And if you know much about biology, you probably know that every species of organism has at least one species that is a pathogen that's specific just to that one host. And that's obviously pretty simplistic, but we know for sure with mammals and our crop plants and things, there's many species specific pathogens of that one host. So if you add all of that up, I mean, you quickly come to the conclusion that most life on the planet it's a parasite. And we don't have a lot of parasites of animals that are fungi. Most of our parasites and pathogens are bacteria and some viruses. Plants seem to be the main target of a lot of parasites of fungi. Fungi seem to really home in on plants, and that's what I studied in their symbioses when I was a doctoral student. They're pretty fascinating to me. So we can move on with some symbionts. So these are going to be some mutualistic symbionts. Things like mycorrhizal fungi. Not much were known about mycorrhizal fungi way back when I was a student, several decades ago. Now we know and know just how important they are for all life on the planet. So if you encountered recently or coming up soon when you're in the forest, if you encounter things like amanitas or king boletes in the forest, if you can contain yourself to look around to see what their habitat is, which is hard to do, they're pretty awesome. You'll notice that there always seem to be with certain types of trees. Obviously, they're growing from the soil, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out they're not really growing from the soil. They're actually growing from the root tips of those trees that they are the partners with. And the fungus absolutely cannot grow there without its plant host. And likewise, the plant absolutely cannot grow there without its fungal host. They depend on one another. You can see where these things are attached to roots. It's kind of hard to see with adult large trees because, the root tips, who knows where they're attached at the root tips, and the root tips could be anywhere. It's easier to see this connection on baby trees. So if you, for whatever reason, are digging up seedlings, you can spot it. These are bristlecone pines that I dug up in New Mexico several years ago to plant at my house. We have all kinds of Southwestern plants at my house because I can't help myself whenever I'm out here. And anyways, on the tips of these little baby bristlecone pines, the tips you'll notice are fattened, and they also look moldy, like they're rotting. It's not a mold, that's its mycorrhizal partner. It might be Amanita muscaria. That's a common partner with bristlecone pine. And if you know about bristlecones, they occur really high up high elevation. And this is one of the really common mushrooms you'll see fruiting with them. There's probably other things fruiting them with them as well. But anyways, that's its mycorrhizal partner. So that's what the fungus does the whole time. It's attached to the root of the tree, goes out in the soil, brings stuff into the roots, and then if the conditions are right, when it's time to fruit, and then it makes mushrooms, which are the reproductive structure, and the spores blow away. So here's how important these mycorrhizal fungi are for plants. Every agriculture textbook that's in any agriculture college course or mycology textbook, etc., has photos just like this. You can grow seeds of different types of trees, like these little pines here, and grow them in like a glass container with up against a glass slide or something, so that you can take a nice pretty picture. And so what you'll see is, as the little seedling starts growing and its roots go down in the soil, the roots of this little tree actually stop here. The roots of this little tree, this is roots, that actually stops right here. That's the root. All the rest of this, all the rest of that is not plant. That's the fungus. So you can see how much more surface area, how much further away from its plant host this fungus goes. And so if you learned in school, when you're talking about plants, that the above ground part of the plant, the green part, is up there in the air. That's photosynthesizing. It's getting carbon dioxide out of the air, and it's using the energy of the sunlight to fix the carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. That's what that green part up in the air does. Then there's a stem that kind of holds it up in the air. Then there's the roots down in the soil, and the roots, of course, bring in the water and the nutrients and stuff like that. And it turns out that's not actually true either. The fungus is responsible for bringing in the nutrients in the water for the most part of the tree, and especially in very nutrient poor areas, dry areas, mountaintops, prairies, etc. These fungi are even more important because they really are the only way the plant oftentimes gets enough water and nutrients. So they have these obligate associations. Here's a little cartoon to show what's going on with this Amanita muscaria. It's attached to the roots of the tree. The tree photosynthesizes. Carbohydrates go down to feed the roots, of course. The fungus gets some of those carbohydrates, and that's what it's living on. The fungus brings in its mycelia, its hyphae, go out into the soil and brings in various nutrients as well as water, and those go into the plant. How they get into the plant is by this picture over here. The fungus actually, sort of like a parasite, a beneficial parasite, but like a parasite, when the tree starts growing as a seedling, it invades the root tissues of the tree and actually grows into the root and in and around the cells. It doesn't penetrate the cells, not in the case of this kind of a fungus, and then forms this sort of sheath, that moldy part on the little seedlings I showed you, and then goes far out into the soil, believe it or not. This wasn't known, 100 years ago, but people just started studying these things. There's another type of a fungus. So these are ectomycorrhizals. A lot of our mushrooms are ectomycorrhizals. The more important ones are the arbuscular or endomycorrhizal fungi, and they form these little Christmas tree-like things inside the cells, and then move out into the soil. These are even more important and seem to be partners with many more groups of plants than the ectomycorrhizals. Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about them because most of them can't be cultured. Probably most never have sexual reproduction, and oftentimes don't even have the capability to have sexual reproduction. So we really haven't seen a lot of them and know much about them. We know that they're in the soil because we can find their DNA, but that's about it. But what we do know is that they're really probably the most important organisms on the planet, even though we don't know much else about them. So these mycorrhizal fungi, how common are they, and what do they look like when they produce mushrooms? Well, a lot of things that we saw at the fair yesterday, things like truffles and russulas and lactarius and amanitas and cortinarius, which is a huge group, tricholomas like matsutake, lacarias are partners with all kinds of trees, nearly all the boletes, and oh my gosh, we have so many types of boletes, chanterelles. This is like a laundry list of all of our favorite mushrooms. And I'm pointing this out because since you are the mushroom experts, probably in your family or in your group of friends, for sure you've been asked, so what's the deal with these king boletes or these chanterelles? Why are they so expensive to store? Why doesn't someone just grow them in a box like they do with meadow mushrooms, the white button mushroom? Well, the reason is because you can't grow them on dirt. They don't rot stuff. They grow with a living host. So it's possible to grow their living host in your yard, and then maybe get truffles or chanterelles to fruit around that tree, maybe, but you can't just grow it on a box of compost or something like the button mushrooms. Even some things like morels seem to be mycorrhizal. In fact, the majority of plants on the planet, am I standing in the way? No, no, I'm not. The majority of plants on the planet seem to have this obligate association with fungi, and especially the trees. Probably all groups of trees, every single tree you see out there probably has an obligate association with the fungus. Now, again, it really is sort of a parasitism. So if your plants are growing someplace where you're giving them an abundance of water and nutrients, the plants we know actually will kick out their mycorrhizal fungus partner because they don't need them anymore. So if you go golfing a lot and you don't see a lot of mushrooms fruiting on the golf course around oak trees, or if in your yard that's perfectly manicured and watered lots, and you fertilized the lots, if you don't see mushrooms growing around those trees, what's going on? Well, those trees don't need the fungal partner to bring in this sort of material to the plant, so they actually can just kick out their partner. But in nature, mountaintops, forests, etc., the fungi are pretty much essential. Okay, so maybe just one or two more stories, because these are some really fascinating things to me. Fungi that have changed the course of the world over time. Fungi and fungi-like organisms. So here's your next quiz question. What are these? Right, they are potatoes, but why would you have said that? Have you seen potatoes like this? You have? Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so these are a lot of wild type potatoes in South America where potatoes evolved at the center of origin. So there's lots and lots of species and kinds of potatoes. From a few of these, of course, Europeans developed our modern potatoes. And so this was a pretty cool thing when Europeans discovered potatoes in the New World. They brought them back to the Old World. They could be grown very easily and make tremendous amounts of food from just a few plants, a few seeds. So it was such a wonderful thing that lots of places, the people really came to rely on potatoes for pretty much all of their calories. And well, you can imagine what's going to happen next. If you bring back one variety and just grow fields and fields of it, there's going to be a pathogen that figures out how to wipe out that monoculture, right? And of course, that's exactly what happened. In the mid 1800s, the natural pathogen of potato, I shouldn't say the natural pathogen of potato, the natural pathogen of the genus of potato discovered potato, made it to Europe, and then started wiping out this plant, and then people started starving. In combination with, there was some revolutions and things also going on in Europe, caused these mass calamities. We know about the Irish potato famine. That's the most famous episode of all this in the mid 1800s. Multiple years, pretty much the entire potato crop failed because of this fungus-like organism and mass starvation. But it happened in lots of other European countries as well, pretty much everywhere that they were growing potatoes, Germany as well. So lots of immigrants came to the New World and other parts of the world as well. And again, Ireland was the most hardest hit, so that's why we still pretty much call this episode the Irish potato famine. So at the time, there was 8 million people in Ireland, and something like a quarter to a third starved to death, and something like a quarter to a third immigrated. So you can imagine, just a couple of years ago, when 1 million, or probably maybe twice that many, frankly, died of COVID out of 330 million in the United States. This was really horrific. 1 million out of 300 million. It's horrific. Imagine if 100 million of the 300 million Americans died of COVID. I mean, that's really unthinkable. Well, it happened in Ireland and other places. In fact, it was so bad that the population in Ireland, 8 million at the time when this happened, it still hasn't even rebounded. There's still fewer people in Ireland to this day. It still has not rebounded after this calamity. Caused by this organism, was long thought to be a fungus because it grows like a fungus. It's actually an oomycete, or a water mold. It's an ancient sort of precursor, sort of algal-like organism. It grows like a mycelium, so it was long studied as if it was a fungus. It's not truly a fungus, but it's very good at killing solanaceous plants, especially potato. This scene here probably took just a few hours to a day to happen. When the organism lands in a field of potatoes and begins sporulating, within a day or two, the entire field, no matter how big the field is, can be completely wiped out. The fungus moves so quickly through the soil. It produces spores that can swim through wet soil, produces aerial spores that blow, and it's really tough to control because leaf litter and other plant debris from the previous season still has the organism in it in the soil. And also, they go through and pick up all the potatoes. But the little super tiny ones, the little, whatever the culls, the little tiny culls, they could be the size of a pea. I mean, nobody's collecting those. You couldn't collect them. That's enough to have inoculum in the soil to cause this sort of thing. So despite the fact that when you go to the grocery store, potatoes for sure by the pound, probably the cheapest food you can get in the store. Potatoes are the most expensive crop to grow because you can't wait till this happens. Farmers have to spray like continuously, prophylactically to keep this from happening. So farmers in the East, like up in Maine where they grow a lot of potatoes, Wisconsin where they grow a lot of potatoes, basically just those families just continue to lose money every year. They're doing it because they like doing it. They've always done it, but it's really, really expensive crop to grow because of this organism. So how did this? What's that?
Big crop in Colorado.
Big crop in Colorado. So yeah, farmers wised up, several decades ago and started moving potato growing operations to places that was sort of outside the ecological range of this Phytophthora oomycete. So like Idaho, Colorado, etc. And they don't have the same problems. You can't necessarily grow all of the same type of potatoes. So potatoes for, like Russet Burbank grows around here, and Russet Burbank like things grow around here, those baking potato types in Idaho, but potatoes for chips or red skin potatoes or whatever, most of those are grown in Maine or Wisconsin or Minnesota. So there's different types that do better, different places. How the heck could this have happened? Here's how it happened. So potatoes evolved, and again, this is, when all of this happened, this is 150 years ago. Potatoes evolved here. This is where potatoes were. The pathogen was never here. The Phytophthora potato causes late blight of potato. It actually was discovered to be more in Central America and southern part of the United States on other types of solanaceous plants. This was discovered by my postdoctoral advisor at the USDA and also a scientist at North Carolina State, Jean Restano. Jean Restano, she's pretty much the one most responsible for discovering this by going through herbaria collections of plants and things and figuring out when and where these plants were affected with the disease. I point this out because herbaria right now are under constant attack of going away because they're expensive to keep, and they're of extreme importance in solving things like this and figuring out what a solution for this is. So potatoes were found here in the new world, taken to the old world, grown here for decades, and now there's trade back and forth as people start settling North America. They brought, of course, trees and crop plants and potatoes with them. Now Phytophthora finds potato for the first time ever, jumps onto it, and trade routes go back and forth. So potatoes going back over here or other plant material, and now Phytophthora made it to the old world and started wiping out potato. What was weird was through plant breeding and some other tricks, was discovered how to develop resistant potato plants, and so the disease kind of went away. And this is because there's two mating types of the fungus. Weirdly, one mating type made it to Europe a long time ago, decades ago, a century ago. But the other mating type never did. So there was never any sexual recombination. And so once this did happen, I think in the 1980s, very recently, now the resistance in the plants has been broken, and now it's another big problem. So the companies that are getting you excited about eating like sweet potato chips and carrot chips and taro chips, I kind of think this is the strategy because there's still a very real chance potatoes could be ultimately wiped out and we need some other snack food. So as crappy as carrot chips are, they're better than like chewing on your shoe. So I'm willing to, keep that in my pantry just in case, as a plan B, because I have to have my snacks. Anyone that knows me knows I like my snacks. So this happened a long time ago. There's been other cases where fungi and other microbes have literally altered the course of the world, because of immigration stuff. And good thing stuff like that doesn't happen anymore, right? Well, think again. So this plant is coffee. This is obviously a sick plant. The leaf looks sick, but these are the coffee cherries on the plant here. And so this next story will be about this coffee rust fungus, Hemilia vastatrix. Have you ever heard of coffee rust fungus? You will very soon. So if you're British, you know about it because, the British, of course, are famous for drinking tea. Well, it wasn't always the case. Let's jump ahead to, yeah. So when coffee was discovered in northern part of Africa, there's lots of different species of coffee here, and it was historically used as a stimulating drink. When this was discovered by Europeans and brought back to Europe, people couldn't get enough of this stuff. They would brew this stuff up and you would be alert and convivial and everything. And this was awesome. British were famous coffee drinkers. Coffee shops started up everywhere. And in fact, it was so popular that they started growing coffee plants. And one of their biggest colonies, India, which at the time was called British India, and also Sri Lanka, which at the time was called Ceylon, basically turned this into one big giant coffee plantation. They were caffeinating the world. Again, basically a monoculture of one type of coffee. So you know what's going to happen next. A pathogen gets there and starts wiping out these things and completely extirpated it. Now the British people and other Europeans are, they're jonesing because they're used to having their caffeine fix. So about that time, they also said, well, our traders going to Asia, we found this other plant that's also kind of stimulating tea. Let's start growing that as a replacement. And so to this day, that's why there's so much tea grown in India and other places that were former colonies of Britain. And to this day, why the British are famous tea drinkers. But it wasn't always the case. They often drank coffee. Well, it got wiped out in here. So people growing coffee just kept moving coffee to other parts of the world where there was no coffee rust fungus, and ultimately moved to African countries because there was no coffee rust fungus there. And as you could see, wherever they planted coffee, these are the years where coffee rust fungus showed up and wiped things out. So the greatest plan of all was to move across a very large ocean. There's no way coffee rust fungus will ever find the coffee there. We'll grow coffee in South and Central America, and Brazil and Colombia and Central America. These are still to this day big coffee growing regions. And I mean, there's no way coffee rust fungus can get over there, right? Except, of course, it happened and started wiping out the crop. What the fungus does is it also kind of like that Oomycete phytophthora, it can spread by a whole number of different ways. Aerial spores, splashing around with water. As people come through and pick the coffee, they get spores on their bodies and clothes and move it around. And this is a really big problem. If your potato crop gets wiped out, that's one thing. Next year is another season and you can try again. When you plant coffee bushes, it takes 7 to 10 years before they start making any fruit. If your plant's 2 or 3 years old, you've been investing a lot of time in growing them. If they get wiped out, you never even got a crop. What are you going to do? Are you going to try again and keep waiting and waiting for a crop to come in and start making money? Before long, you give up. And that's actually what's going on now. So in this part of the world, Colombia, to some extent, Brazil's a big country, and they have other products they produce. But Colombia, and especially these small countries here in Central America, like Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, the entire economy of those countries is coffee, 100%. They banked on coffee always producing a lot of money. And so there's the pickers that get paid to pick, and then they take them to the shippers and they get paid to ship. And then everybody buys stuff at the cafes and the grocery store, et cetera, et cetera. The entire economy is based on coffee. And during the late 80s and early 90s, these countries' coffee crops were being decimated to the tune of like 25% reduction in a single year. And then the next year, 25% more of that crop reduced down to the, getting things down so that a lot of people went out of business. And what happens next? What happens next is those caravans of migrants coming from Latin America that are seeking a better way of life, that's on Fox News 24/7, are real things. But why are they? Is it political oppression? Yeah, in some cases, but much of it has to do with just economic distress. And they're coming to the US to try to find other jobs because the economies back in their home countries have been devastated. If you dig deeply into some of the news stories about it in the New York Times and Washington Post and other places, they'll tell you that this is what's going on. The economy got destroyed by La Roya, the coffee rust fungus, but not very often. It's usually just sound bites, and it's like, what's going on? Why does everyone think they are going to come here and find more jobs? Well, this is what's going on. The economies have been just totally destroyed. So if you think that fungi changing the course of the world is something that happened a long time ago in colonial times, absolutely can still happen to this day. It's going on every single day in the US border. So one other theme that runs through the entirety of my book is this Haida Pacific Northwest indigenous people mantra. Everything depends on everything else. So when you think about these different types of mutualistic and parasitic symbioses that fungi have with plants, keep that in mind. Everything depends on everything else. When the environment changes for the better or the worse or whatever, it trickles down to all of the different types of life. So it's really important, I think, for us to study what's going on in the environment now to try to get a baseline before it's gone. So hopefully we can make improvements and protect what we have left. So I think I've hit my 60-minute mark, and thanks for your time.